Why aren't you in the Liberal Party?
It's a good, interesting question. Look, I think
This is The Payoff with me, Sylvia Jeffries, thanks to Airbnb. Allegra, welcome back to The Payoff. It's great to have you here again.
Thank you so much for having me.
A lot has happened since we last spoke.
Yes.
I mean, it feels like years ago. Last time we spoke, you were in the battle to reclaim your seat of Wentworth, and of course you were victorious in that battle. Congratulations. What do you think it was that got you over the line with voters?
Look, I think a lot of it actually, I think policy, to be honest. I mean, I've been talking about tax for a long time, and you and I have spoken about it before. And what people I think really valued was that I'm sort of in the weeds in policy and really fighting for good policy, as well as aligned for the values of our community. Like, the community I represent, they don't like culture wars. They want to take climate action. They're very business savvy as well. And so they're sort of looking for real balance. And I think that was a really big part of it. But a lot of people came up to me and said, look, thank you for taking on something as tricky as tax, because no one wants to talk about it. We know it's important, and we admire your guts. As one guy said to me, he said, I didn't vote for you last time. I thought you were a bit of a lightweight, but I've changed my mind. I'm voting for you this time. I was like, okay, I think there's a compliment in that.
If ever there was a backhanded compliment,
That's
that
one.
could be it. I think there's a big conception that the seat that you represent, the electorate you represent of Wentworth, is full of really uber wealthy boomer age people who are very well set up. You were very vocal throughout the campaign, though, on issues facing young people, in particular financial issues facing young people. Why was that such a big issue for you in the seat of Wentworth?
Look, I think two sides. One is the seat is much more diverse than people will give it credit for. So around 60% of the people in my electorate live in apartments, 40% rent. So it's actually really, it's more so than the rest of the country. So, and a lot of young people who come and want to live there but just go, oh my gosh, I'm never ever going to be able to afford a house. And to be honest, I was talking to this woman up in King's Cross the other day. She turned up, she had two twins, and she said, look, I used to be a nurse, but I went back to uni and became a doctor. Works in one of our local hospitals, says, we earn a good wage. My husband earns a good wage. We've just paid off our HECS, but, I just feel I'm well paid, but I just cannot see how I'm ever going to be able to buy a house. It's something on my mind every single day. And when I hear her story, gives me a huge, it's people like that make me go, I really want to make sure that the system is working for you. But so many people in Wentworth come and talk to me about that, whether or not they own their own home. They'll come and talk to me about their kids, their grandkids, other people they meet through work who go, look, these young people are working really hard, but it's so hard for them to get ahead. And people really feel this sense of that's not fair. Even if they're doing okay, they go, it's not fair, and we do need a system that better supports young people. So it's both the people I meet, but also, I think that's very much what Wentworth wants. We want a country where everyone can, get a good life.
The cost of living was weighing heavily on people as we all went to the polls earlier this year. Have you seen a shift in that? At the last RBA meeting, they decided to keep interest rates on hold. There seems to be a bit of a disconnect between that approach and what people are really feeling still out there.
Yeah, I think it is still weighing on people. Maybe it's just people have gotten used to, they've done all the tightening of their belts and they're sort of getting used to a new normal. But I know that people are still really waiting on tenterhooks, really looking every RBA meeting very carefully, really, looking for more drops, because it still really matters. It's still really hurting a bunch of people.
So as the Labor government was re-elected, Anthony Albanese renewed as Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, of course, lost his seat of Dixon, along with the title of Opposition Leader, replaced by Sussan Ley. I'm very interested to get your thoughts on Sussan Ley, and specifically, is Sussan Ley the answer to the Liberal Party's women problem?
I think that we will see. I think the truth is, it's a bit startling, to be honest, looking at the mix of Parliament, because we are now, across the Parliament, 49% women. Now, that is something we should be celebrating. It is, just 2 terms ago, we were 36% women. We'd been in the 30s, low 30s forever. So that we're at the stage that it's, we're almost 50-50, it's incredible. But, when you look at the numbers, you dig into the numbers, we've got 10 out of the 13 people on the crossbench are women, 9 out of the 43 people in the coalition in the lower house are women. So they're still around 21%, which is really startling. So, when Sussan Ley was elected the leader, I texted her and said, congratulations. And it is historic to have a woman as leader of the coalition. I think that is a really positive thing. But whether that turns into the party representing women and pre-selecting women and electing women more broadly, that's up to them. And, that's really, I think, the challenge both to her but to every member of the coalition, in Parliament or in the branches.
She has so far been reluctant to fully commit to quotas. Do you think that's what's required?
Look, it's up to, I can't tell the Liberal Party how to fix things, but when they say, we have an aspiration, we have a target, I think they need to look in the mirror and go, you said the same things after a series of previous elections and it didn't turn into results. So I think they, really need to go, well, what is actually going to make a difference? Because I think, Australia, in my electorate, for instance, we have, I think, the biggest single group, demographic group in my electorate are professional women. And around the country, that is these are big groups. And frankly, people just don't get it. I mean, I genuinely don't get it. Why do they have 1 in 5 elected people in the House of Reps are women, but across the Parliament we're 50-50? Women are willing to stand and people are willing to elect them, but they need to work that out.
I'm sure you would have heard it a million times, but in the post-mortem of the coalition's enormous defeat at the election, a lot of people were saying Allegra Spender is exactly the kind of woman that the Liberal Party should be attracting. Why aren't you in the Liberal Party?
It's a good, interesting question. Look, I think so what are the things, I come back to who do I represent? I represent Wentworth. When I ask people what's important to them, they say, I want a community, and this is in the words of actually someone who I met on the street over 3 years ago. He said, look, I care about the environment. I want to pass it on to future generations. He said, I want to live in a kind society. I want us to treat each other with decency. And he said, and I'm a small business owner, and that's super important to me. And I think those 3 values, like this sense of stewardship for climate and the environment, a sense of community and care, and then also pretty rational approach to economics are the values of our values of Wentworth. They're certainly my values, but I don't see those in the coalition. And, we're back again, once again, debating climate policy like climate net zero, and it's like, wow, didn't anyone read the results of the previous 2 elections? This shouldn't be a battle of we shouldn't have the Nats once again trying to sort of throw out net zero. We need to be rational about the challenges that we face, and we need to just address those full head on, with evidence-based policies that work for business but work for the community as well. So, the culture wars of the last election, the attack on work from home of the last election, the once again failure to embrace serious climate action. These are all reasons why, I look at the coalition and I go, that's unfortunately, it doesn't look like my home.
Yeah, yep. And it was all there in the previous review, so there'll be more reviews into the reviews, into those reviews, and let's see if anyone acts on any of it into the future. But let's talk tax, because this is the big topic of the day. It's a big topic, I think, of this term of Parliament. Certainly the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is taking big steps to look at tax reform here, and it's been on your agenda for a long time. You recently held a roundtable discussion of your own in Canberra. What were the biggest takeaways from that?
Look, I think what was really interesting in that roundtable, where we got basically, I think, most of the leading experts on tax in the country together, people like Ken Henry, who wrote the Henry Review, but also people like Michael Brennan, who used to head the Productivity Commission, Bob Brunig, who's one of the leading academics in this space, so Michael Stutchbury, who used to edit their Financial Review now.
Used to work on this floor of this building.
I know, now at the Centre of Independent Studies. So we brought together a broad range of people and said, really focused around what are the big challenges in the tax system. And I think some of the biggest takeaways was how much agreement there is around the problems that we're trying to solve. And I think that's probably the most important part, because unless you can agree there's a problem you're trying to solve, then you can, play with solutions all you like, but you need that first point. And there really was a huge agreement around, firstly, we are overburdening younger people in our tax system compared to other parts of our economy, and that is hurting them in ways that are not good for our society. I mentioned that young woman I met previously, but there are really some of the stark statistics that I've been coming across are things like two households living next door to each other, one retired, one sort of working age, both on $100,000. The retired household on average pays half the tax of the young household. And, if you were thinking about a tax system, you'd be going, that was punishing young people. You'd probably design something a little bit like our tax system where you pay more when you're younger, when you're trying to pay off your HECS debt, you're trying to buy a home, you're trying to put your kids through childcare, you're doing all the things that cost a lot of money, as you know, as I know. But that's when we're sort of taxing you the heaviest because we're really taxing, because we've got a tax system that's very focused on, wage earning. So I think that's. I think there was a lot of agreement around that, and actually a significant agreement around that we do need to look at how do we how do we actually trim sort of tax concessions on sort of things like capital gains or other areas,
passive income.
Passive income, so that you can reduce the burden or basically make sure you don't just keep on increasing taxes on working people through bracket creep. So I think there was a lot of unity around that. I think there was also a lot of unity around sort of the challenges of business taxation, of wanting to drive more investment, but also wanting to make sure that we got the right amount of tax from resources, particularly things like the gas resources and other resources. So that's some of the more trickiness, I think, in the corporate tax space. But that focus on young people and that sort of focus on needing to shift the tax system around that, I think, was really a key takeaway.
Negative gearing is always a hot topic, of course, and Sally McManus, the union boss, recently just floated the idea of capping negative gearing to only one investment property. There are a lot of people who would think that's pretty reasonable. But, of course, we know in the past negative gearing's been a vote killer. So do you think the federal government will have the appetite or the political courage to touch negative gearing?
I don't know, and I think we'll see. We'll see if they do. And I think it's, the next few weeks will be pretty instructive. But I think that I think there are arguments, I think, to go, how do we tilt that tax system back towards income earning, not passive income earning, like labour, basically people working, because that's where it doesn't matter who your parents are. If you can get a job and earn a wage, that's your chance to get ahead. But if we're sort of focused on a tax system that's really rewarding more passive income, that's really hard for young people who haven't had a chance to build up wealth. So I think that negative gearing should be on the table. Different ways, other options, and one that was suggested actually during the roundtable was to say, look, you can put your losses of negative gearing against the income of the house, but not your wage income. So, okay, you're getting your income from your rent and stuff like that. Okay, your mortgage income, your mortgage costs, put those against those losses, but you can't then reduce your tax that you're paying on your wages on that. And that, I think there's a lot of support for those sorts of changes as well.
What was brought up around bracket creep and how we can address that?
Look, I think people recognise how hard it is because it makes such a big difference to the budget. The only way the budget is currently going to get back into the black in sort of 10 years' time is through bracket creep. But something, again, really startling statistic, the RBA released recently, if you look at the last few years and you look at what has had the biggest increase in cost for family budgets, it hasn't actually been, on average, increases in the interest rates. It's actually been increases in tax through bracket creep. So bracket creep has had more of an impact on household budgets, on average, than interest rate increases. Now, obviously, individuals, will have had different experiences, but on average, that's how big a push bracket creep is. That's how powerful it is, particularly in a time of high inflation and high wage growth. So I think I've really been pushing, and so have other independent MPs, to say we should be looking to index brackets so that when your wage goes up, if your wage is only going up at the same rate as inflation, you don't basically start paying a higher average rate of tax. But it is that will require significant changes to concessions, probably some sort of really significant spending restraint, and maybe looking at GST as well to do that sort of scale of change.
Okay, so GST, do you think that's going to be expanded? It's in the paper today.
Oh, no, I saw it in the paper today.
Productivity Commission is pushing for that as a way to address these issues.
I think that I've always been of the belief that GST should be on the table because it is one of the few big levers you can change. So if you really were going to change our reliance on income tax, if you're really going to deal with bracket creep, that is a way you could, GST is certainly one pathway to do it. But, and I think people worry about GST, and rightly so, because they worry, everything's going to get more expensive. But I think the ways that you can deal with GST is to compensate, particularly those people who are least able to pay, particularly sort of vulnerable and lower income households, and use it as a way to also make changes to income taxes and also to some of the state taxes. Some of the worst taxes that were mentioned actually in the paper this week were on things like stamp duty. It's one of the worst taxes around. It's a tax on divorce. It's a tax on moving. It's hard to change. It is through sort of some of the big tax changes like GST that you could help make that transition out of stamp duty.
I want to go back to negative gearing again and capital gains tax, because housing affordability is such a big issue for younger generations, and that ability to get into the market, and this idea that some generations are taking more than their fair share of what exists in the current property market, which, is challenged by others. However, is there any evidence that tackling negative gearing would make housing more affordable for younger people?
So I think you're right to raise this, because I think in negative gearing, I'm interested in negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, mainly because it can help reduce, you could help us reduce the burden on income tax for younger people, not because it's going to transform the housing market. I think, those changes could tilt the system a bit back towards homeowners as opposed to investors. But we need to do a lot more on housing to really make that housing different. So I want more money in the pockets of younger working people because I think they really need it. But we've got to do a bunch of other stuff also on housing. And, the Productivity Roundtable has some of those other topics on there, and I'll be really pursuing them and that roundtable because those are the super important topics, things like regulation, things like even like AI. How could that help us solve our housing problems? Those are some of the issues that need to be there too.
So ultimately, the point of tackling negative gearing would be to keep more money in the government's coffers so that they can take less through income tax.
That's from my point of view, yes. I think that is the bigger impact on housing than, for me, that's the bigger piece rather than it's going to fix the housing crisis.
The other one that gets people a little jumpy is the idea of an inheritance tax, which kind of sort of already exists through the 17% that is applied to superannuation when someone passes away and that money's handed down to younger generations. What are your thoughts on inheritance taxes? It's
interesting. It came up in the roundtable. Actually, one of the younger people in the room said, "What about inheritance taxes?" And there's a really good answer from again one of the participants who said, "Look, there are many countries in the OECD who have inheritance taxes, and they just basically don't work. So we can put aside whether or not how we feel about them to the point of are they going to solve our problem?" And apparently, they raised something like 0.5% of taxes in all these other countries because there are so many carve-outs, so many people get around them in so many different ways that they just aren't going to work. And frankly, Australians don't want them. So I think for people to go, if we could fix the tax system, if we just had inheritance tax, I think we need to be really realistic. It wouldn't fix the system. And I think I can't see it being possible because I just don't think the Australian people want it. And frankly, that's a big part of the tax system we're not talking about, which is that if the people don't get behind it, it's never going to change. Yeah. So we're doing a lot of both these sort of expert roundtables, but also community engagement because the community has to think that this is fair. Yeah. If people don't think it's fair, then it's never going to fly.
Well, it sounds like we're putting a line through the inheritance tax. The other topic I want to raise with you is the the extra tax on the superannuation balances over $3 million. Now, there have been several critics of that on this show who have said that needs to be indexed. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, firstly, when I look at the super system, and I come back to those younger people I'm talking to, I have real concerns that we've got a super system which I think has ended up in a situation where I feel we've got too many concessions basically in the super system as it currently stands. So on principle, I support tackling high balance super because I think the super system is there in my mind to help people save for a comfortable retirement. When people have many millions of dollars in the superannuation system where it's very favourably taxed, I'd prefer to use that tax concessions again for a younger person than I would for someone who's got many millions in the super system. So on the principle, I think the government is right to look at that system if, again, the money's going back to younger people. Then the question comes to two issues with it. One is about taxing of unrealised gains and also indexation. And I've been critical from the start, particularly around the taxation of unrealised gains, because I think that if you make an investment, if in a business, maybe you're or buying some shares, these values go up and down.
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't.
So
you
haven't made the gain until you've made the gain.
You haven't made the gain until you've made the gain. And that's generally how our tax system works. And I think that's an important principle of the tax system. So that's what I've raised, to the Treasurer. There are ways of mitigating some of the worst effects, things like having what they call a clawback mechanism. So if you make a gain, but then you make a loss in the following year, you get the tax back, or giving people more time to pay so that if, they've got something, like a business that they can't sell out of quickly, they have a bit of time more to pay. Those are some ways of getting around it, but I don't think it's I don't like the current structure basically of the change that the Treasurer is asking for.
So a lot of the topics we've discussed so far have been on the table. They've been widely discussed. There's been a lot of narration around a lot of these issues. Did anything surprising come up at your discussion?
Again,
anything creative?
Anything creative? Look, we had Lucy Ellis was interesting. She suggested that on the indexation of brackets, they should go up by 2.5% a year because that's right in the middle of the inflation band. So that was quite an elegant way of dealing things. That's a bit nerdy. I mean, I'm sorry, I know this is a bit of a nerdy comment of interest. Look, I think then there was also a big discussion a bit more on the environmental side of things. And on things like fuel tax credits, which are how big mining companies in particular pay less for diesel than you or I would when we go to the petrol pump. And I think there was, it's some good debunking that went on there. Someone said, look, if you change that, the cost of your groceries is going to go up. And the Grattan Institute said, look, actually, we've modelled this and the cost of the grocery increase would be, I think, less than a cent. So sometimes what you're doing is actually there just dealing with it. But and I guess the lastly surprising piece was just actually the consensus about young people. And I think that consensus has been building. And so now the question is turning that consensus into reality, into packages that probably won't be perfect. We won't like all elements of them, but that's what we need to be doing, having packages of tax reform that help young people in particular, and then also deal with things like our resource taxes, where, again, I think there was a lot of shared view that we're not capturing the value, particularly from our gas resources, that we could be in the tax system.
Are those big companies paying their fair share?
Look, I think different companies pay different amounts, and I think we've got to split up those companies and say who look at them in particular. And I think, again, the resources companies are ones where it's the tax system. That's up to government and people, politicians like me, to design it, but. And then everyone plays to it. And I think the point is, I don't think it's well designed enough. And I think that it means that we're not capturing the value. Now, to give you an example, I think we used to capture around 30 cents in the dollar for every dollar earned of gas. We now capture around 7 cents in the dollar in our tax and royalty system. So in that sense, No, I don't think we're paying, certainly not enough on gas. And I think in our resources, there was Ross Garno and Ken Henry both said if we had brought in sort of a carbon price and a minerals rent resource tax back in the day as they intended, would now be in a budget surplus. Yeah. So I think sometimes I think some of the scare campaigns many years ago did us, did the country badly, because I think it's put us in a much worse situation now than would have been.
So if we're collecting 7 cents on the dollar from those big resource companies, how does that compare to the lowest earners in Australia and the tax they're paying on income?
Oh no, I think that's exactly right. Like I think I think we should be doing better in that area. Push the government last term. I will continue to push the government, particularly on gas. But I think we need to be ready for the next resource boom and make sure we've got the system right.
So Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, is holding his own economic roundtable next week. Are you involved in that?
Yes, I am.
And what would be the key message that you would want to put to him through that discussion?
Look, I think there are three kind of key areas, and one of which is obviously tax. And I don't expect that roundtable to solve the tax system in an afternoon. But what I would really like to see is a commitment from the government and from the people in the roundtable about the need to drive the tax system around helping young people, around helping business investment, and a process, because it will take more time, to designing those together. That I think is what we should be really seeking from the tax system. I think two other key areas we're going to be talking about is regulation, and I think that's really important when we're talking again young people and housing. If we can't get the regs right, we're not going to be able to build the houses we need. So I think for a big push for me would be like getting that regulatory environment right, and also getting AI to help better government services. So, happy to chat through how they work, but those are some of the things how do we really drive productivity in things like housing, because that can actually help solve real people's problems.
There has been some criticism out there that Jim Chalmers is using this roundtable as cover for an agenda that wasn't taken to the election, that wasn't put to Australian voters at the election, and therefore he doesn't have a mandate to pursue tax reform. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think governments will continue to evolve their positions. I don't know if they may take some elements of tax changes, may put them forward in this term. Others they may take to the next election. But I think it's really important that we look at economic reform to set ourselves up for the future. And I think so. Generally, I think this is a very positive move by the government to try and bring this group of people together, and then they can choose, I think, out of what comes out, how what do they need to put forward straight away, what they may feel they need to mandate from the community on. But these things, I mean, if you look at some of the tax changes that we have put through as a country, they take time. They don't sort of they don't sort of pop up in a couple of months. So I think that's pretty important.
So if there was one piece of policy or legislation that could make a genuine impact on young Australians over the next couple of years, would it be bracket creep? What would it be in your view?
Look, I think bracket creep. If you could move on bracket creep, that would make a huge one. But then the other one, I'm going to give you two. The other one is housing approvals, and I raise this because it now takes. It used to take around 18 months to build a set of apartments. It now takes around 28 months. Yeah. We've gone backwards in productivity of construction by around 12% over the last 15 years. That just means it's more expensive and slower to build things, which means that young people are locked out of housing. So we need the regulatory settings to be such that it's just faster to get stuff done. If we're ever going to get out of this piece. So that's why,
do the unions play a role in that?
Absolutely,
well?
The unions play a role in that. I think we've got a lot of problems with our construction industry, and there's a lot of people to be answered for from the CFMEU, for example, in terms of the impact on that construction industry. But I think if we can get housing approvals faster and those processes faster, that will make a really important difference. And I don't know if you saw Scott Farquhar, who one of the founders of Atlassian, was at the press club the other day, and he was talking about how we could use AI to actually make people's lives better in housing. His suggestion was, imagine, you had AI looked at all the approvals in your area for the last, 20 years. And then, you as an external person trying to lodge, a DA, which is such a nightmare. And you could send it through this AI system and at least work out, if you're likely to be approved before you go to council. Imagine some of those things that we could do to make it easier for people who want to do the right thing, but it's just such a laborious process at the moment building houses.
You mentioned earlier the attack during the election on work from home.
Yeah.
Jacinta Allen in Victoria is going in the other direction, wanting to enshrine that into law 2 days a week for public and private sector. What are your thoughts on that? Is that the right move?
I think that's a bit, to be honest, I think that's overreach. I think, I was just having this discussion with my team actually about working from home and saying you have to work it out with the jobs and with your people. I think that's the way to do it. And that's certainly the way I've always done it in my previous workplaces and jobs. I recognise that, some of the best people I have hired have not, it has not worked to be in the office, full time. And you work with them. But I think you do have to do that on a person by person basis to make sure it's practical and it works. And so I don't think that, this is stuff that is up for government to legislate. I think this is up for employers and employees to work out practically how this works.
It might not even be up to the state government
exactly
to legislate that. Well, Allegra, it has been great to chat. We really appreciate your time on this topic today, and we will look forward to seeing what comes out of the Treasurers Roundtable too.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Allegra.